Long-time affiliate of this institution, as most of you probably know, and currently the chairman of the board of directors. We have, it is our privilege today, I think, to have what I have every anticipation of being an interesting intellectual exchange. This nation, in its national narcissism, often pays attention to what's going on in the world, mostly from a perspective of how much pleasure or pain that it produces for us, without often understanding what other people think around the world of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think that probably applies in the case of what we're trying to do or think we're trying to do relative to the Western Pacific and Asia at this point in life. In 2011 or so, we decided we were going to pivot to Asia, coming out of a couple of wars, or at least in one of them in the drawdown phase and the other one ended. And while that word was not well understood, maybe even by those who coined it, we started speaking of rebalancing in Asia. And that may have softened things a bit, but it's not clear to many of us just how the effect of that has had on those who live in the space that we thought we were pivoting to, or we were rebalancing, or pirouetting to, or whatever. And so it seems to me to be useful today to get a perspective of someone who lives in that AOR, who has a long standing opportunity to understand the region through a long and successful career in politics and in governance. One who started with excellent academic credentials and later had a phase of his life that in the university as a professor and running a university, and one who's now in the diplomatic world. And we have asked him to give his perspective on how we're doing out there, how this rebalancing is going on, not only from a perspective of the influence that we have had or not had, but how others in the region see us and are thinking about this aspect of our policy. So Ambassador Kim Beazley has agreed to do that with candor and I'm sure insights that probably nobody else around here has. And we're pleased and privileged that you've agreed to do that. Sir, you can speak as long as you like. It is on the record.
Yeah, I'll go on the record.
On the record.
Yeah, I'll do
on the record.
Yeah. That's okay.
You, sir, have the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Chairman. It's a privilege to be here. I find I know at least half the faces around the table, and it's good to see you all again. It's nice to have an opportunity to discuss something which, of course, is obviously very close to Australian hearts. I have to say, when we look at things like the rebalance and we look at American commitments in the region, we in Australia are definitely the glass is half full people. We want to see the best in every action by the Americans, and to interpret things in a way that is supportive of the view that whether it's lurchingly or smoothly, the US is moving in the direction that the President had indicated they were. So, okay, if you're looking for the underlying prejudice in the remarks I'm about to make, take that as the underlying prejudice. This is a very, very important month for us, those of us who are concerned about these matters. Firstly, next week, our Prime Minister is making his first visit as Prime Minister to the northern part of the Asian Pacific region. He is going to Japan and South Korea and China in that order. And he has previously spent a considerable amount of time in Southeast Asia, and this will complete the process. He's not yet visited as Prime Minister of the United States, but that will be done during the course of the year. But more important than his visit, important and vital though that is, it's also the month in which the President will do his long-awaited visit to the region, both to a couple of points in North Asia and a couple in Southeast Asia. And we have great anticipation of the effectiveness of that visit, and we see it as having been preceded by some extremely useful discussions recently between the President and Chairman Xi, or President Xi of China, and also a very useful trilateral between the President and the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea, which we can discuss a bit later. And when our Prime Minister is in North Asia next week, there will be another American statesman there simultaneously, indeed in Beijing, absolutely simultaneously, and that is your Secretary of Defence, Chuck Hagel. So there's a lot of, our embassy has been full of reporting in the course of the last couple of weeks. We have been pouring information out of here as we interrogate every element of the American bureaucracy and those who are commentating on the American bureaucracy to give the Prime Minister a feel of where things stand at the moment. We're also doing it against a background which probably demonstrates, at least subliminally, but nevertheless really, the proximity that Australia has to the region we're talking about. And that is the role that we currently have in the search for the missing Malaysian aircraft, which has basically been coordinated out of my hometown. And I note many things which have resonance for me as a citizen of Perth. Firstly, you're operating out of Pearce Air Base. Well, Pearce Air Base more usually is employed for the training, the ab initio training of the Australian Air Force and the Singaporean Air Force. When it's not doing that, generally speaking, it is one of the staging points for the frequent Orion P3C patrolling that Australia does of the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. You see too these ships departing from Stirling Base, HMAS Stirling. Well, that is our main base on the west coast of Australia. The Navy in Australia is split between an eastern western coast operation, and the west coast base is HMAS Stirling, and you can see the Australian warships and hired civilian ships deploying from there. And the American kit to look out for the pingers was being put aboard the Australian ship Ocean Shield at HMAS Stirling. And as discussion has proceeded, you've also seen mention made of Butterworth in Malaysia. Well, Butterworth has significance because Australia has since 1971 operated from Butterworth. Generally speaking, we would have at any point of time a squadron of Australian F-18s at Butterworth, P3C aircraft doing joint patrols under Operation Gateway with the Malaysian Air Force, and Australian soldiers routinely rotated through Butterworth Air Base. You'd have seen a British submarine joining us in recent days, and a British boat, the HMS Echo, on its way to join us. You see New Zealand aircraft operating with the Australian aircraft, and it would remind those who are familiar with the area that there is a military alliance operating in Southeast Asia between Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia. that is the five-power defence arrangement. And that is an important part of Australian engagement with Southeast Asia. So several things are teased out here. The proximity that we have to the region is teased out here. When the Marines go in, and they started coming in this week for their annual rotation through, as agreed with President Obama, their annual rotation through Darwin, they started this last week coming in, they are closer to the South China Seas than they are to Melbourne, the capital of Victoria. Australia is just geographically situated critically in the southern tier of the region. So we're not cynical when it comes to the question of whether or not the Americans are engaged. We actually want to believe the best of American intentions in the area. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Of course, since the President announced the rebalance, it is the nature of democracies that instantly the opportunity is taken for oppositionist positions to be placed and critical eyes drawn to it and benchmarks rapidly established and rapidly assessed as having failed to be achieved. That is the character of the world in which we operate. So we have to cut through a lot of that to work out whether in fact they're not being achieved or whether in fact they're being achieved perhaps in a different way. The announcement, of course, was believed by two groups of people, and it was believed absolutely, and it froze some of them with fright and angered others. The Europeans believed he was talking the truth, and they did not like it one little bit. There is a view, of course, that NATO remains relevant, that the United States commitment to the European zone has to be absolute, complete, that Europe does not feel secure without that sense of continuing American commitment. And the moment anything goes untoward, as is indeed it is at the moment, there is a constant assertion to replicate something like what once was. Whether or not that's possible, nevertheless, that's put up there. And that's the intellectual background, the experience, if you like, of what there'd been in the past. That was one. The second area that took a great deal of note of that was American friends in the Middle East. The feeling that the United States is moving away from commitment to the Middle East very actively engages the attention of American allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, and perhaps raises the hopes of one or two other countries in the region at the same time, but certainly is a focus of interest. That's a concern that those express concern about it. And I think the concerns that have been expressed belie two things. The first is that what the United States is trying to do in Asia now, particularly when it comes to the economic and diplomatic element of the built-up connection, is exactly what Europe is doing. You know, as we speak, the Europeans, both individually and via the EU, are approaching all the countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia for new trade agreements. The Europeans are enormously active in directing the activities of their governments to the region, backing up what is already a heavy engagement by European commerce. So the notion that somehow or other the United States is lighted in some lesser important area is to a degree belied by behaviours from some of those who are most vocal in expressing concern about it. The second thing is that the complaint in a way ignores what is critical about what the United States brings to the table in East Asia. Why should anyone in East Asia and Southeast Asia be interested in an American commitment? Well, why they should be interested is precisely because the United States is a global power. And it's the only global power they get to have a relationship with. So if the United States ceases to be a global power, then the value of a relationship with the United States to the countries in the zone is substantially diminished. It's easy to pick out one area where this might happen to be the case. One of the factors that makes the United States so interesting to countries in the region is the fact that the United States is engaged in the Middle East and engaged in the Persian Gulf. When Kurt Campbell used to be your Assistant Secretary for East Asia, he asked me a question once, and it was Kurt generally only asked you questions when he knew the answers to them, but but on this occasion he actually didn't know the answer. And he said, when Australian foreign ministers go through Southeast Asia and South Asia, do they ask you questions about Israel and Palestine? And now our answer to that, my answer to that question was, no, they don't. They don't ask us anything about the Middle East. He says, funny, I would have thought that. But when I go to Indonesia or I go to Malaysia, go to India, though that wasn't in his bailiwick, but it's the first question they ask me. What is happening with Palestinian issues? What is happening with Israel? The simple fact of the matter is the Muslim world is basically an Asian world. You could take the entirety of the Arab population, stick it in Indonesia, and you'd still have population change left over. And that's the biggest Muslim nation. That's before you start on the second biggest, which happens to be India. Or you move over to the third biggest, which happens to be Pakistan, or the fourth biggest, which happens to be Bangladesh, or go to the only effectively functioning at the moment Islamic democracy, and that happens to be Malaysia. So there's the Muslim world, whatever its theological origins, is basically an Asian world. And for the Muslims of the Asian region, the fact that the United States might be able to resolve or help resolve issues which resonate with them intellectually is critical. But the fact that the US does that is not because the US is disengaged from the Middle East, but because the US is engaged in the Middle East. Now, even more important than the confessional matters are the economic matters. There is only one country, and only really one country that will ever be able to guarantee this, that ensures that there can be safe passage of product coming out of the Persian Gulf. Now, there's a readiness to accept the significance of the Persian Gulf economically, globally, but actually the Persian Gulf is increasingly meaningless globally. Where the Persian Gulf is massively meaningful is in Asia. 70% of the market now for Middle East oil is in Asia. That is rapidly going to go to 90%, and for all we know in the course of the next decade, given developments elsewhere, probably 100%. Basically, the Middle East oil will be an Asian matter and no one else. Who guarantees access to Middle East oil? Well, the United States, but only if the United States is still playing the global role and has the capacity to play the global role that it is. So the very fact that the United States is engaged in Europe, the very fact that the United States is engaged in the Middle East, the very fact that virtually by definition of that, the US is a global power, is exactly what the United States brings to the table in the rebalance. So this sort of carping and muling and peeling that has gone on ever since the President made that statement, which I think is simply a statement of the bleeding obvious. It's simply a statement reflecting reality as opposed to a statement reflecting intention, is I think has been somewhat untoward. Now, what is for us? However, the fact that he's decided, or the US has decided to recognise that reality, is the end of a century's struggle since the creation of Australia as a federated nation in 1901. The principal objective of Australian national strategy has been to get a powerful ally to state that the region in which Australia lives is the most important region it too inhabits. Now, we have failed miserably in that task, but we have struggled manfully in the process of getting that proposition established by really our two allies, first the British and then the United States. So when the President made statements like that, you can see that we really wanted to see the best of it. Cast your minds back to the days of imperial defence in the region, a period of time when the United States definitely was not engaged and very disapproving of the arrangements that were there diplomatically in the East Asian region in the early part of the 20th century. The Australian getting of wisdom occurred within 1 year of our federation. We federated, in part at least, to defend ourselves. We thought a more effective defence amongst the 6 colonies could be mounted if we were a unified nation. But even on that basis, the assumption was it was British imperial defence that would do it. And within a year of our creation, the British decided to outsource the defence of the British Empire to Japan. In 1902, Britain had, east of Suez, 22 battleships and 28 cruisers. By 1910, the British had 16 cruisers east of Suez and no battleships. Indeed, by World War I, the heaviest battleship in the Pacific area in the British domain was the HMAS Australia, which was a battle cruiser, which in fact scared off the German cruisers out of the Pacific into the Falklands area, where Beatty's battle cruisers destroyed them. And but they were running from the HMAS Australia, which outgunned and outsped them. The moment the German cruisers were destroyed, the British redeployed HMAS Australia to the North Sea so it could take part in the Battle of the Jutland, which revealed how truly weak battle cruisers were as a design. But that's another matter. But fortunately, that wasn't tested on HMAS Australia, which survived the war. But that was the point. The Australian response to that was, hang on, you've just outsourced the defence of Australia to the principal enemy. That was the Australian view about Japan at that point of time. From then until 1941, there was a constant argument in the British imperial defence system between Australia and the United Kingdom that they'd got it all wrong and could they kindly do something about it. And there were many mistakes made in Australian policy in that time, particularly in relation to Japan, but that was the perspective. It was a perspective righted, not in the end by the British, but righted in the end by the United States, because it was the United States that actually in 1941 picked up the point of utilising the Australian geographic position as a mechanism for defending the country. It's hard to look back on these things. Probably Australia doesn't have a better friend in Asia than Japan. The Australian-Japanese relationship is very important, and you're going to see that absolutely exemplified by the sorts of things that Tony Abbott says when he gets to Tokyo next week. But that is a very different picture now, at this point of time in this century, from the point of time you'd have found, the attitude you found in Australia at that point of time then. So we have been trying to get you engaged. Generally speaking, we failed in relation to the United States. And the cathartic moment for Australia in relation to the United States was 1969, when President Nixon announced the Nixon Doctrine. And what President Nixon said in announcing the Nixon Doctrine was that in areas of secondary importance in the global order, America's friends best help themselves. The US would do what it could, but they ought to look to their own defences in the first instance. That was a remarkable point of getting of wisdom for Australia, who actually started to take seriously the idea of at least defending the approaches to the continent after Nixon, not after we arrived at that conclusion ourselves, but after Nixon told us we'd better arrive at that conclusion. So we did, and we changed the structure of our defence forces in order to be able to handle, in the first instance at least, the approaches to Australia. But it had always been the case for Australia, to that point of time and still now, that arguing that your principal ally ought to be prepared to treat your region seriously actually required something of you. And in Australian terms, there's always been the assumption that if allies need help, then Australia will provide it. So we do not wish to see the defeat of Great Britain. We did not wish to see the defeat of the United States. And if it was burden sharing was required, then burden sharing would be done. Probably the most significant piece of burden sharing was done by Australia in the 1960s, though not what people might think in terms of a commitment to the war in Vietnam. It was the decision to attract the possibility of Soviet rockets by establishing important elements of the American central system of deterrence in Australia. Three. One was Northwest Cape, which in those days was an important communication station for American ballistic missile submarines operating in the northern Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific. When the Americans introduced the Trident system, they no longer deployed to those areas, so the Northwest Cape facility now communicates primarily with Australian and American attack submarines. But then it was part of the triad. The ballistic Poseidon, Polaris needed those other operational areas. We also needed to participate in American early warning. Distant early warning system here gave the US President about 15 minutes warning of an attack on the United States, which is about just enough time for him to turn the keys on the football to launch an American counterstrike. Not really a good amount of time to make a rational decision. A bit of a problem if the Aurora Borealis showed up as a Soviet nuclear strike, which from time to time it did, on the radar system. So the facility at Naranga doubled the early warning time. So the likelihood was that if the Soviets had ever launched an attack on the United States, it would have been an Australian squadron leader and the Air Force component of the folk manning Naranga. Squadron leaders were the Australian shift commanders. They weren't all Australian, but some of them were. Would be telling the United States, or at least would be telling the Cheyenne Mountain that the United States was under attack, and there would be a response accordingly, or not, as the case may be, as I said in the aforesaid Borealis, Borealis showing up. So that was and then Pine Gap, whose functions are still highly classified and cannot be talked about, and are still a very important installation, but also related to America's war-fighting capabilities. So that's what Australia did. So when the President made that statement, it was music to our ears. But it also was music to our ears in another way, is that if you happen to be an American looking at American national interests, like what else would you do? I mean, why wouldn't you have that view that your policies ought to prioritise affairs in the Asia Pacific? You take a look at the global economy. What is the driving point of the global economy now? About 50% of global production is driven out of the Asian Pacific region, and given that the United States accounts for a fair slab of the other 50%, that's pretty important. When you take a look at where your markets are going to be, You've got 580 million members of the global middle class now inhabiting the Asia Pacific. In 10 years' time, that'll be close to 3 billion. Now, I mean, where else are you going to sell your product if it's not in the Asia Pacific region? Europeans have worked that out. Middle Eastern countries know where their oil's going. It's simply a no-brainer. And the United States is not actually in a bad position to do things that seem like more is being done. Firstly, there never was a neglect of the North Asian region during the period of the Cold War. Really, the rebalance is not about North Asia. If you look objectively at American policy right through the Cold War, Japan and South Korea were critical components of it. They got lots of American troops involved in both countries. China has always been important to US policy in various ways at different points of time. Sometimes as the principal object of hostility, sometimes as a force to be balanced against somebody else who's the principal focus of hostility, but it's always been important. What hasn't been important is Southeast Asia, and that's the difference now. That is important. So it's in that region too, of course, that you have both this dichotomous position. One, it's a good thing that the United States is more heavily engaged with us. Two, we don't believe it. That's the area in the region where there is a level of concern, if you like, not quite cynicism, but apprehension in relation to what the Americans are doing. And I would argue, we do argue to the Southeast Asians this, because we are not in the business of going around Southeast Asia telling them that the sky's falling in and the Americans aren't seriously interested, and we'll reinforce every complaint that you have to make about the United States. That is not the approach that Australia takes to the conversations we have in the region around us. As I said at the outset, the glass, from our point of view, is half full. The announcement does not keep having to be made. As we say in the region, you don't actually need the President or the Secretary of State to make it on a monthly basis. The statement has been made. What's necessary now are the building blocks. And slowly and steadily the building blocks are coming in place. The conversation with the countries of the region on things that are important to them in security terms is taking place. The US is carefully, and it's not very expensive, moving to enhance, for example, the surveillance capabilities of pretty well all the countries of Southeast Asia. Little packages that improve their Coast Guard capacity, the capacity of their radar systems to see what is moving around in the region. Can't happen fast enough, so it seems, in the South China Seas at the moment to enhance that. Capability building. Then there's the diplomatic engagement, frequent visits by senior American diplomatic figures, constantly discussing needs sometimes in terms of economic development. The Mekong River project, enormously important in the Indo-Chinese area. There's a whole range of these sorts of activities that the United States is finding itself involved in, and it's easy to have a conversation because that is exactly what is wanted of the United States. There's also, however, because this is a fluid area where the diplomatic lines, the international relations structure is not set, there is a question mark in their minds over what the Americans mean for the stability of maritime arrangements in Southeast Asia. If you looked at the one flaw in Asian development at the moment, the one flaw in the simultaneous rise of a lot of powerful economic states, it's not just China. There's Vietnam, there's Indonesia. When I was Defence Minister in 1987, I was responsible for the writing of our white paper, and the Australian GDP was greater by a substantial margin than the combined GDPs of all the ASEAN states. Well, this year, there's 10 of them. This year, Indonesia's GDP alone went past Australia's. Shows you how fast this zone is developing economically. Unprecedented in global history is the simultaneous rise of a lot of powerful states economically that have not settled the boundaries between them. That never happened before. It's the first time it's happened with the boundaries not settled. So the United States brings to that the possibility that it actually will be settled on the basis not of force majeure, but some form of negotiation. Now, that has not played out. We don't know where that is going to end up. But that there is the possibility that it will be resolved by something other than force majeure is only present, because the United States is in the equation. Were the United States not in the equation, it would be settled. But that would not be the way negotiation would not be the way in which it was done. And these are important issues to the countries of the region. Because when you're operating in Southeast Asia, you're operating in the last bastion of the Treaty of Westphalia. These are the last group of people on earth who believe passionately and profoundly in the idea of the sovereignty of the nation state, and that is it's the aspect of the ability of the United States to be useful in the context of the idea of sovereign states settling their affairs among themselves as respecting sovereign states is something that the United States brings, and in this context uniquely, to the table in those discussions. So that's where I think the rebalance is at the moment. It has its cynics, it has its opponents, it has those who are fearful at the possibility, but from the Australian point of view we say, be copacetic, this is all good, and it will all turn out all right in the end.
Well, no, that was just wonderful. I don't believe that I've ever, and I've dealt, as I talked to you a little bit before, I've had several professional exchanges with Australians in my lifetime, and I don't believe I've ever met an Australian that I didn't like, and that I didn't find could combine serious thought with enough humor in it that it just left me with and I think it leaves all of us with a kind of an optimistic perspective that we may not always have otherwise. And thank you, sir, for that. I failed to mention at the outset all of the various portfolios that Ambassador Beazley had held in his life and is in this wonderfully successful political career that he had. And he mentioned defense, of course, finance, several others, transportation, communication, aviation, on and on and on. But it's the finance now and the defense that's critical at this juncture that you and I were talking about, and right. You mentioned in your remarks. This nation has had a little trouble maintaining its fiscal responsibility over recent times, and that's affecting in a profound way our defense component. It's pretty hard to have an effective defense mechanism if you can't pay for it. And we think we can't pay for ours now that we've been maintaining. We've got a modest little $496 billion budget request at the moment, which we think will hamstring us in such a way that we can't do some of those building blocks in Asia that you're talking about. We can put the odd submarine out there and 2,500 troops and this and that, but significant. We've decided we're going to have only 2 global carrier battle groups that's operating at any one time, and so on and so forth. So come back to us a little bit with fiscal interface between defense and how one goes about pay for. How do you see us as you look at our $17 trillion deficit that's almost certainly going to go much higher over the next decade? How's that play out when you look at how reliable your partner's going to be out there in the Pacific?
Well, let's say you can afford to come back quite a long way and still be capable of playing an influential role in the area, whether you perceive that to be the case or not. However, not effectively spending that $496 billion, it could be a serious problem. A serious problem in one area. The one thing that is important in the capacity of the United States to continue to play that role is not actually the rebalance of the forces to, the 60-40 split, that sort of thing. That's good, but it's not the important thing. The important thing is force modernisation. The United States is a long way ahead of capabilities in the area, and with the inventions on the table at the moment and potentially in production, the United States is capable of going further ahead. So the US will be decisive in any region it chooses to engage itself in, provided it does that wisely, provided it can sustain the force enhancement that comes with those abilities to improve your capability all the time. The threat to that in the budget at the moment is the cost of personnel in all the facets of it. The current balance, which is roughly 50-50 between capability and personnel, is capable of sustaining that level of American superiority, but not if, as is projected, it goes to 75-25 over the next decade. So that is the challenge, really. How do you keep those figures at 50-50? 50% in capability and operations, 50% in personnel. And keep
What
that.
is it in Australia?
Probably about that.
About the same.
Yeah, I think it'd be probably about
High-priced,
the same as that.
high-priced.
Well, when I came in as Defence Minister, in the capital budget, we were spending 6%. So we made massive changes in the structure of our acquisition policy and in our defence production, in our personnel, civilian, and to a lesser extent military. And we went to about 30% on new capacity in about 3 years. So you can actually rebalance internally if you get things right quite quickly. The problem is that what is necessary to enhance and advance American and global security interests is the end of defence spending in this country, which has the least political saliency. And what is least necessary has the most political saliency. How you treat your personnel, what their resources are, where your facilities are, dual purchase of items of equipment, all this sort of stuff is all politically. A lot of it's politically driven, and one of the things you do get very respectful of if you're engaged in democratic politics, like I've been for most of my life, is how powerful the individual congressman and senator is, and how difficult the life of the individual member of the House and the member of the Senate is if he gets the feelings of his constituents wrong.
A lot of people came because they wanted to engage you, and so I could ask you questions for the next hour or two or so, but I'm going to let other people. Ambassador Kim,
Yeah.
start off here.
Great to see you.
Well, thank you for what you said and for all that Australia does in support of joint interests and missions. And I wanted to ask about this pivot and in terms of the attention. I take your point on in terms of the pillars being built. If in fact what happens in the South China Sea is critical with issues of borders, I don't see myself from outside the level of diplomatic engagement to stabilize, if you like, to work out some of these issues that need to be dealt with to avoid a bigger problem, given the challenge of managing the several rising powers and us being largely a status quo power with our allies. And if I have to look at the last 6 months or a year of U.S. diplomacy, it's largely focused on the number of visits that the Secretary of State has to Israel-Palestine by comparison, or some of the other regions that we are pivoting a little bit away from, seems to be disproportionate to at least what you described, which I find compelling and persuasive. So I wanted to ask that undiplomatic question. Sorry about that. Yeah.
You know, I think it's a great irony, and I'm not sure it's really sort of well understood here. Certainly not well understood in the region. At this point of time in his tenure as Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry has visited Asia more often than Secretary Clinton did to this point of time in her tenure. Wow. So that's the first point that needs to be noted. The second point that needs to be noted, and this is a point that we need to make forcefully to our friends in the Asian region, and in a different way to our friends in the United States, is the points I made earlier about the significance of the Americans' Middle Eastern commitments to its friends in Asia. I've said it often to folk in the State Department, please start to include in the speeches that your people make a conflation of your Middle Eastern activities and your Asian activities, so that the folk in Asia know that there's a lot of Muslims in Asia who are interested in decent outcomes in the Middle East, and they want to see that. There are a lot of governments in Asia that are interested in the free flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, related. It's not often, Americans do not often relate well the interlocking character of their international engagements, and so there's that component of it, which is important too. The other is to actually sort of move the rhetoric on, so that whenever somebody is talking about Southeast Asia or East Asia, it's sort of not talked about in the context of almost making the announcement again, but now starting to treat the level of engagement as part of the furniture. When you come to the South China Seas, well, that's a story still very much in the making. But the most important thing for countries that are literal states to the South China Seas, the most important thing for them to know is it's just about the first item of American business every time they have a conversation with the Chinese. So it's not to say that agreement is being reached. It's not to say that perspectives are properly shared. It's not even to say that things are going necessarily in the right direction. But what you can say is that it's not for lack of focus that these things are occurring.
We had a question right over here, I believe.
I have two questions. I have two questions. My first question is, how do you see the recent developments in Europe And how has, because the US is now focusing on new developments in Ukraine, in Crimea after the annexation of the territory to Russia, how has it affected to US pivoting to Southeast Asia, and whether that would have or would make the other countries in the region like China to embolden its activities, because China has already annexed Crimea, for example, and perhaps China is also as big as Russia, and if the US and EU could not do anything about Russia, and Russia is not hurt, for example, and that would embolden such kind of activities in East Asia. And my second question is your views on the recent trilateral summit between US, Japan, and South Korea. How has it affected to security in East Asia? The meeting is not just about how to deal with the DPRK, but it also has far-reaching impacts on regional security. So, what is your assessment of that?
Well, it's two very important and very broad-ranging questions. I think insofar as East Asia is concerned, the question on the Ukraine goes back to this point that I made about the importance of the Treaty of Westphalia to the countries of the area and their view of national sovereignty. From their point of view, what happened in Crimea is very bad. And it's been obvious that the Chinese have struggled to slot in what the Russians have done in Crimea to the Chinese world view. For starters, the Chinese are not looking for opportunities for votes to be held inside China on where various parts of China might wish to locate themselves. So that is not part of the Chinese view about what ought to be happening, nor is it part of the Chinese view that it is a good idea for somebody to decide that they'll see such a vote take place and then intervene to uphold it militarily. So there is nothing happening in the Ukraine which is good news for China. Further, there are things happening which would be difficult for China. Were the United States to start to seriously pursue economic sanctions vis-à-vis Russia, Russia is perhaps only just beginning to comprehend how potentially damaging these things are, because of course for the whole of the Cold War, what happened in the eastern economies was irrelevant to anything that happened in the West, and vice versa. That is not true now. In the global financial dance in which we're all participating, you don't want to have a dance with a ball and chain around your ankle. And if the United States puts a ball and chain around the ankle of Russia, the shining example of what happens to you when you've got a ball and chain around your ankle is, of course, what's happening in Iran. That is that's a really difficult thing for the Chinese to have to contemplate. And as the Russians come to them to look for the possibility of offsetting help, if the Americans do impose and the Europeans impose those restrictions on them, the Chinese are not necessarily convinced that their financial systems can sustain it. So there are all sorts of difficult questions for the Chinese that are arising out of all of this. They have a relationship with the Russians which is enormously important to them. That relationship is now starting to cost. So that's there's that component of the of this situation that needs to be thought through. Firstly, it's not a good event from what we can see of what the central principles of Chinese foreign policy, and it's not a good event in its potential outcome for the Chinese. Now you go over to the question on the trilateral relationship. I think the fact that the United States managed to get a trilateral discussion between the Japanese and the South Koreans is a major advance. The Japanese and the South Koreans have not been well situated over the course of the last few months. But the president obviously managed to sit them down and obviously get them to focus on important things in their mutual security and advance a security agenda which includes how you respond to a nuclear North Korea. A nuclear North Korea is beginning to impose enormous burdens on China. The last thing China wants to see is a situation occur which forces them to put more and more emphasis on their own nuclear capabilities because defences in the region become more and more potent and sophisticated. If this North Korean nuclear development keeps on going, the Chinese are going to find a trilateral arrangement on things like ballistic missile defences, which are going to produce some very potent shields. If you're going to be able to protect yourself in that environment with a power that has a capacity to launch about 10 minutes away, then you're actually going to have some very sophisticated defences indeed. And you're also going to have a very substantial military capability. Now, how much more of this do the Chinese want? We often look at the difficult decisions that are being imposed on us. Take a look at some of the difficult decisions that are being imposed on other people. I mean, I actually think that the Americans have been able to quite calmly approach the situation in Ukraine. It's been, from the American point of view, just a simple step-by-step process of working through sanctions. Nobody expects the United States realistically to put 400,000 men into Ukraine to confront Russia. That's not a sensible outcome or a serious possibility, and it would not be a sensible outcome or a serious possibility for any American president, not simply this one. And so that's not on. So what does the United States do? Well, the United States looks to the fact that unlike the Soviet Union, the Russians have global economic vulnerabilities. And so the United States, recognising that the world has changed since the end of the Cold War and has created different opportunities, the United States is sensibly selecting those opportunities that can go after, and sensibly selecting them in a way that doesn't impose burdens on the Europeans. Just working through how you might impose a sanction on oligarchs or the banking system or something like that. One of the things that 9/11 has done, the tragedies of 9/11 has made the Treasury of the United States one of the most virulent combat forces in global history. And it's becoming very, very good at imposing very great burdens on people that the United States finds recalcitrant.
It is one of our mysteries. You bring up a very good point that when we reorganized the nation for its security in 1947, that we did not include the Treasury Department as a statutory member of the National Security Council. Eisenhower, the first president who de facto made, although not de jure, made the Treasury Department, he required his Treasury Secretary to attend all NSC meetings. Dick, you had a question.
My indigent daughter has been signalling me from USC demanding sums of money. I have to tell her I am in a meeting. It won't take long.
Large sums?
No, but I'm not scarcely in a position to go and provide them at this moment. Right. Yeah. Right, sorry.
Dick Sullivan.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to raise the Ukraine issue in a somewhat different way. No military power, however strong, likes to get caught in a two-front war, much less a three-front war. Now, a year ago, I would have said, well, a contingency around Iran, probably most likely. Second most likely might be the Chinese doing something, given their concerns. Mr. Putin has raised another issue here. We approach East Asia now in terms of rebalance. The Chinese don't have a balance of power conception of what they're looking for. This 9-dash line business, which they will not repudiate, is basically saying this is our space and you should over time get out of it. My concern is that one, we will find our resources and attention increasingly drawn to the NATO area and maybe to the Persian Gulf region. And in that situation, the Chinese watching us constrained in the degree to which that we can deal with the Putin initiative may conclude that, well, this is the right time, let's say, to put troops on the Senkakus, on the Diaoyu Islands, that we would be constrained from reacting. And so my question is, given the collaboration that is developing that you've described in East Asia, how would that kind of a contingency play out where the United States is likely to be increasingly focused on Western Europe and the Gulf area?
Well, if the Chinese were to land on the Senkakus, I actually think the Americans would be the least of their worries. You know, sometimes get a little bit overly of the view that the US's poor devils are the only players in this game. I would expect if the Japanese chose to react, and this is one of the reasons why I hope this would never happen, then the Japanese would win. And that would be, no, they'd have to put serious force into it, but this would be a very difficult point in global politics were that set of events to occur. But it would not necessarily be a set of events that would, in the first instance, engage American armed forces. In the South China Seas, the Americans have done something different. To this point, the United States has sort of soldiered on with a position which is the Australian position, which when anybody asks a question about the 9-dash line or its implications is to say that this is a matter that needs to be resolved by international negotiations. This is a matter that needs to be dealt with, if it's going to be dealt with in a disputatious way, in a court, and that all powers ought to cease their rather foolish efforts at trying to prove various reefs belong to them, and leave this as the international outfit that it is at the moment, show that it is at the moment, arrive at a collective agreement if you're going to exploit any area of it economically. That was the American position, and that remains the Australian position. The American position changed 3 weeks ago. The American position accepts all of that and then added an additional thing, which was to say that the claim in relation to the 9-dash line was simply out of whack with any conceivable interpretation of law of the sea arrangements, and that the Chinese needed to contemplate that. It was a warning shot. If you try to do an ADIS in the South China Seas area, like was done in the East China Seas, the ADIS that they put out in the East China Seas drew protests, including from Australia. But it was at least within the framework of what was an ongoing dispute, if you like, between the Japanese and the Chinese about the status of the Senkakus, and it sort of was of a piece of yet another phase or aspect of that. If you do that in the South China Seas, however, well, Australia operates surveillance flights out of Malaysia over those areas. All the states of the region function their militaries in those areas. The globe operates civilian ships through and aircraft through those passages. You are going to suddenly find yourself not juggling one ball in your relationships, that is your relationship with Japan, which now happens to be at a low, but you're actually going to juggle multiple problems, and you're probably not going to be able to enforce it. And you make a claim that you can't enforce, you lose face big time. So there's short of a confrontation, if that 9 dash line were ever to come into play, it wouldn't be simply a question of problems for the United States and what the US would do. Problems for Australia, problems for Singapore, problems for Malaysia, problems for Vietnam, problems for Indonesia, and Chinese would buy themselves a species of misery and potentially humiliation. So there's not in the Cold War, things were often a zero-sum game, and it was what would Russia do, what would the Soviet Union do, what would the United States do. Not like that round Asia. Lots of players. And lots of players, when you localise the issue, that are quite capable when you localise the issue.
Dimitri Symes, president of this institution.
I was very interested in your description of the Chinese position on Ukraine. And I actually completely agree with everything you said, with one important caveat, that the Chinese also have another very important interest. They don't like when governments of countries are being changed by the West. And the Chinese made very clear that their assessment of the situation in Ukraine, that a legitimate government ran into a very serious problem with the United States and the European Union. And that's how the whole situation has started. The Chinese vote at the UN Security Council was a very interesting one. The assumption in Washington is that it was a victory for the United States that China did not support Russia. In fact, the assumption in Moscow seems to be exactly the opposite. That first, China has refused to support the United States and the European Union despite everything you had, but there was also another issue. I know from both Russian and Chinese sources that Russia actually had an opportunity to try to persuade China to veto that resolution. Russia has decided against that, because in order to persuade China, Russia would have to pay a price, and you just mentioned the price essentially, to start supporting Chinese positions against Japan, South Korea, Senkaku Islands, and etc. So my question is, we were very surprised by what Putin had done in Crimea, and I don't think that we had to be so surprised. Would you be terribly surprised that if we have crippling Western sanctions against Russia, if Russia would have to swallow its pride and offer its services as a junior partner to China, an arrangement which would not work in the long run, but in the short run can create a very different dynamics between China and Chinese neighbors.
That's a really interesting point of view, and what I think, and it does show the difficulties. In probably the best example, I think, in the 20th century of effective delimitation of borders and arms control in the entire 100 years was negotiated largely away from Western view in the 1990s between China and Russia. Extraordinary detailed delimitations, what troops were allowed in what areas, which allowed the most significant strategic rebalance of the 1990s, was a shift away from being essentially a Central Asian focused ground force base, medium range nuclear weapons, labour intensive Chinese military, to a sea-based maritime Pacific looking Chinese military in the course of about 10 years. They decided, though the Chinese leader of the day said to the Russians at that point, we don't concede that the territories of ours that you have occupied, but we will not persist with our claim on them in order that we get this agreement with you that enables us to stabilise our relations with you and to focus elsewhere. But again, he said, we do not concede the territories of ours that you currently occupy. So that was something that was agreed back in the 90s. The Russians were and Chinese were pretty happy with that Shanghai Agreement that they got for their Central Asian collaboration. It all looks swimming. All of them are beginning to understand the price of it now. The Ukraine has forced them to start to think what price each of them are going to have to pay to defend each other's objectives. It is not going to be cost-free for the Chinese to give the Russians a tick in the Ukraine. And if the Russians go further into Ukraine, it will become even harder for the Chinese to give the Russians a tick for what it is that the Russians are doing. The Russians are having to recognise too the limitations of what becoming more dependent on the Chinese is going to give them in their flexibility, in their economic development, their ability to relate to other countries in the East Asian region. Look, I think that what Putin has done is force all of us to start to play aspects of this game by ear. One does not sense, as you look at what he's been doing, that there is necessarily a systematic track in his thinking about where he is now and where he is going to end up. That we always, when we're arguing with someone, assume for us enormous complexity and confusion in our thinking and enormous rigid direction in theirs. Usually they're as confused as we are. And so there's a lot in this which, the consequence of which have not yet been thought through. And I'm enormously encouraged by the fact that having been so well poised to drive through to cut off the northern part of Crimea from the rest of Ukraine, they're well positioned to do that. It didn't do it. Instead, they sought a conversation and about the future of the place. So there's obviously some restraint on them. From the Chinese point of view, I don't think the Chinese have given these things a minute's thought until now. And now the Chinese are being forced to think about it and forced to react. This is not what they expected out of their engagement with Russia.
I had an early question here. You, sir?
Thanks, Mr. Ambassador, for a great presentation as always. I had a question for you. You touched on the security elements of the rebalance and the diplomatic elements, a little bit on the economic side, but you never mentioned Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I wondered, it's not going to happen this year, obviously. Next year, who knows? But if you could touch upon that. But before then, just a quick follow-up on Dick Solomon's question about the Senkakus. I wanted to understand. You're saying if the U.S. sort of stood idly by if a war breaks out or plays a minimal role, let's say, wouldn't I think that would be a disaster for the alliance. I don't want to put words. Yeah.
What I'm saying is that if the first, and I don't believe the Chinese would do that, okay? But let's assume that the Chinese do, to try to resolve this by some other mechanism and pressure and consultation. The things, the response the Chinese would not have to worry about in the first instance would be the American one, would be the Japanese one. What the Japanese chose to do. And the Japanese have substantial military capability, and really substantial military capability in that area. And there would be, and I don't think that there's for 1 minute the Japanese wouldn't react.
You, sir. Let's get a mic over here.
Oh, you wanted to, I'll take this question.
Oh,
I'll
yeah,
go
the
back to
Trans-Pacific.
TPP, yeah.
I'll come back to you next.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I came from far west of Pacific, and came from Japan. I'm retired Air Force general. And right now, I am ready to my Air Force, and I belong to Japan Air Force. It's okay. But anyway, thank you very much. Very good speech, and I really agree with your comment. And then I have a very bad and sad image for our LDP of Japan. But just only one fruit, one souvenir was to be very good, stable U.S., Japan, Australian military cooperation. They did a very good job. Currently, U.S., Japan, Australia built a very progressive military cooperation. Just focus on some future emergencies, conflict, and then adjust TTP, not the TPP, but the TTP, tactics, technical, procedure level. I mean, very concrete relationship between militaries, and we have a very good concrete progress on the stage of the military forces. I mean, 3MF, 7th Fleet, also PACAF's forces have a very good relationship with Australia and Japan. But there must be just a little bit a difference of temperature in between such kind of a theater forces level and the political of U.S. and some diplomat levels. Just only a beautiful speech doesn't work to the stability on those areas. You need, this is not for your question for you, but question for the U.S. friends. Just only a diplomatic word doesn't work. Our very good neighbor will have some intention to fill in the Bronx. And then how can I solve that kind of problem for us? Thank you.
Yeah, well, there is I'm not sure, but there is a trilateral security cooperation between Australia, Japan and the United States. The trilateral arrangement in no way compares, however, with the significance of the bilateral security arrangement between the United States and Japan. And I think the United States works extremely hard on keeping that relationship with Japan potent and effective and changing to meet the different strategic circumstances that technological change and political change induces for Japan. So there's nothing that I see in what Americans are doing that in any way, shape or form backs off from the intensity of their relationship with Japan. In fact, just the opposite. To pick up on TPP, I think it's very important. In the way in which we've been discussing things here, I think there's one thing that you have to throw additionally into the equation. Part of what is everybody's diplomatic strategy is the incorporation of a successful China within its framework. Nobody's actually looking for a brawl with China. What everybody is trying to do is to get China's rise associated with an acceptable set of practices and arrangements in the region which China inhabits. It's a different thing. This is not what's not going through here is an effort to control or contain. What's going about is an effort to incorporate on terms and to have a big say in the terms. And that brings you straight to the TPP, and I think a really interesting development in all the things that have been happening with the negotiations to this point. When this started as a smaller entity, the Chinese response to it was, this is an effort to contain us and an effort by the US to incorporate small powers against us. Then it expanded to include Canada, Mexico and particularly Japan. And one would have thought that the Chinese response to that would have been to say, see, That's exactly what's going on here. There is an effort here to... Instead, the Chinese response was the opposite. The Chinese, instead of being out there propagandising against this, making life difficult for Vietnam and Malaysia and Singapore to negotiate with the United States by saying, you do this, you make an enemy of us, you know, the sort of diplomacy that they're capable of pursuing on this, is instead saying, keep us informed, let us know. A group in China, the reformist group, is saying this is interesting. Maybe this is the sort of thing that we ought to be thinking about more seriously ourselves. There are others in China who say still the opposite to that. But the Chinese message has become much more complicated vis-a-vis the TPP. At the same time, however, one thing that they do understand, and I don't think people in the United States completely understand, and that is, this is the only dance in the multifarious ball of dances that is there in trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region in which the United States is involved. There are plenty of options for Australia, plenty of options for the ASEAN states, plenty of options for China, one for the United States. So if the United States deals itself out of the TPP, the United States will do itself extraordinary damage. And that's something also that others of us have to realise too when we're negotiating with the United States to finalise this agreement and have it put before the Congress. The US Congress, I think, and not the US Congress, that's far too broadly cast. There are a lot of people in the United States who sort of form the view that international trading arrangements are a form of American aid. That the agreements, the WTO, the other things that the Bretton Woods, the United States negotiated at the end of the last war, and the system which has been essentially presided over by the United States, while certainly right in principle in terms of how international intercourse ought to take place commercially, it's nevertheless has been a granting of opportunities to others and not to the United States itself. There was a bit of truth in that. Certainly when the United States economy was largely driven by domestic consumption, which it has been for the bulk of the last 200 years, it cannot be any more. The reason it can't be is that the left in the United States is basically right. Middle class incomes have largely collapsed, certainly relatively and maybe absolutely. And it's middle class incomes which drive domestic consumption. The United States has to get itself a new middle class. And there is only one new middle class in the offing, and that happens to be the Asian middle class. So the United States gets itself the Asian middle class, then it will prosper magnificently, and the American middle class will accordingly rise. Now that's not the way the United States looks at these things. And it's not the way it's debated in the US. But hopefully, sometime in the next 6 months, that'll be the way it will be debated. Because if it is debated that way, then the United States will successfully conclude the TPP.
I don't know if Harry Reid's stay on fast track is a permanent or temporary condition. It's disastrous. You, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the talk. As usual, very, very interesting. Two questions. One, your comments on the Middle East seem to focus on the Asian view of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. And at least in my discussions with Asian colleagues, other issues refract in not so helpful a potential way. Syria, Libya, Iranian negotiations, treatment of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
However, the complexities.
Yep.
In other words, the way the Middle East refracts in Asia, there's a general sympathy for, we know, Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not sure altogether it would be in our interest, meaning U.S. interests, to put the Middle East into our Asian policy because it refracts in such complicated ways and in some ways very negative ways. a la Korea's response to our red line in Syria, et cetera. So that's point one, and I just would like your response. By the way, on the flip side, if you know, Middle East views of Asian Islam are not altogether generous either. You know, see Saudi Arabia's comments about Islam in Asia in the past historically. So that's one. Second, you mentioned about South China Sea. Now, I think I would agree with you that we went a step further in Mr. Russell's testimony on UNCLOS. Is that something that Australia has gone to the next step on, which is that made a statement about 9 dash lines, and would you also support the Philippine arbitration, and would you also support maybe a more robust role on the part of Australia in bringing ASEAN together on South China Sea?
On the first one, it seems to me, and we don't have these conversations. We Australians don't have these conversations in Southeast Asia. So we're only getting this third hand, as I said to Kurt, when Kurt asked those questions of me. No, they don't raise those issues with us because they don't think we've got any influence. They do think that you have. And yes, there's all sorts of positions that they adopt. But one of the things that is commonplace among them, that only the US can make a difference, whether you happen to agree with the direction in which the US is going. You actually want a conversation with the United States because they can actually do something about it. What's the point of having a conversation with Australia, whether you like Australia's positions or not? In their scheme of things, from their point of view, Australia's positions don't matter. So that's, I take all the points you made about the possibilities that the American positions in various ways will upset them, but that sort of wasn't really the point I was trying to make with that proposition. On the question, no, we have not said what has been said by the Assistant Secretary. We have, however, supported the right of the Filipinos to take this matter to international arbitration because that is part of the mantra associated with how this thing ought to be settled. And we and when the previous ADIS was declared by the Chinese, we said that publicly that wasn't the right way to go. But on the generality of positions, we do say that these things ought to be resolved by not force majeure, but by agreement, by negotiation, hopefully maybe arriving at an agreement before conclusions are reached on what the actual boundaries are. So yeah, in all the diplomatic discussions that take place in the region, we pursue those objectives. I don't suspect that our position is going to change in that regard. But nor do I suspect that the way in which we deploy in the region is going to change either, regardless of anything that might happen otherwise in the unilateral declarations of particular countries.
Yes, ma'am. You.
I just wanted to pick up on the theme in your remarks that the pivot isn't so much a description or policy statement, but a description of reality. I think another aspect of what's going on in Asia Pacific is allies of America and American friends are taking more responsibility for their own defense and cooperating more with each other, sometimes with our facilitation, sometimes not. So in that vein, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about, from Australia's perspective, what are the useful additional roles that Japan might take on? We read yesterday that Japan is loosening its restrictions on exports, and I've read about discussions about cooperation on submarine technology, but what additional functions might Japan play in the region?
Well, there's an outside chance in the course of the next few weeks we might have a bilateral free trade agreement with the Japanese, in which case, if that occurs, then there'll be quite a substantial enhancement of the character of Australian-Japanese relations. I mean, we would certainly advocate to the Japanese that they need to get the TPP done. They need to see that that they settle any arguments they have with the US on that. But then we have our own issues vis-a-vis the way in which the final TPP is coming together. But that's always the case in trade arrangements. The Japanese, the views of various Australian governments for quite a substantial period of time have been to try to encourage the Japanese to work on getting a better posture in the Asia-Pacific region. Australia has been sort of an advocate of greater Japanese engagement, operations as a normal state, all those sorts of things. There's been it's not recent, it's a pretty long-standing Australian objective. And in the context, yes, we do discuss with the Japanese other facets of potential cooperation, economic and in terms of equipment. So we see that as important. Like all countries in the region, we seek to keep our relationships good with all that we have to deal with. Like I said, we're not looking for a fight with the Chinese. We're looking for upholding decent principles in relationships. We're not looking for fights. In fact, we appreciate the character of the relationship we have with China. We also operate on the assumption that the United States cannot be expected to do everything, and in some cases, anything. So within the framework of what international responsibilities we accept, we assume in the South Pacific, the US might choose to do something, but if it chooses not to, we don't worry about it too much. But if governance issues arise in the zone, then it's our responsibility to deal with them, not the Americans. We took a similar view in Timor. And we also assume that the independent relations that we have with countries in the Southeast Asian zone on defence cooperation, counter-terrorist cooperation, these are things that we ought not to be looking for American leadership on. We should just simply be getting on with it ourselves. And I think that the Japanese and the Koreans are beginning to go a bit the same way.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for a very lucid presentation and helping us to see the world from that Antipodean corner. Sometimes we don't take that into account, and reminds me of the map that's turned upside down. Just to
If you do, we get very cold.
I don't want to belabor the Ukraine issue. I know it's been raised several times, but and I agree with everything you said, but I think there's a nuance. You had said that China might find itself increasingly constrained or under pressure from Russian actions and how it might have to fit that into its foreign policy framework. But there's one respect in which I think China stands to gain, and potentially, in a way, Australia might lose. And that is, to the extent that Russia is limited its access to Western European markets for its commodity exports, primarily gas, in Western Europe. And it seeks to offset that by developing markets in the Far East, as it said it's wanted to do, and has to some extent with this oil pipeline to the Pacific. China's going to increase its negotiating leverage. This is not to Russia's benefit. I don't know that's been factored into their calculations. They've been negotiating for 7 years with the Chinese for a gas price and have not been able to come to an agreement. In these circumstances, if they do, it's going to be a much lower price than they had been talking about, which was roughly equivalent to what they were selling it to Western Europe for. And I can see this happening in other areas. As Russia's access to international financial markets is limited, it's going to rely increasingly on China to invest in developing its infrastructure, its resources, including those strategic sectors where they've been very neuralgic about Chinese investment. So I think that's something that in one regard in which China may benefit. And the disadvantage for Australia might be to the extent that Russia exports gas to the Far Eastern markets, develops new LNG facilities in Sakhalin Island. It's going to put pressure on the Northwest Coast projects, Gorgon and others, and push down prices in the Far Eastern market.
Yeah, it's complicated. The Australian fields tend not to go ahead unless the product is sold. about 20 years out. So, because they have to borrow so much money, they have to show the banks the contracts that they have and the prices that are associated with them. So, if there's any threats that emerge from the Russians becoming more engaged in the Chinese market, they're more to future developments than developments that are already in place in Australia. So I don't think we tend to get really exercised about that potential development, because there are a multiplicity of problematic factors involved in the next fields before they go ahead, and that's only one of them. Another is what the United States might choose to do. So, so from our point of view, from the Russian point of view, I would have thought if you're sitting in Moscow, you want to think very, very carefully about how much you become dependent upon your relationship economically with China, and what sort of price the Chinese are going to bargain out of you. They're not bad at it. They're pretty good negotiators, and they're also pretty good at comprehending the ore level of vulnerability and playing on that. And there'll be in that business relationship, there'll be no friendship. There will be Moscow's playing with a lot of potentially very difficult cards once they move into the area of the general economic relationship in terms of what they've done in Ukraine and what it might ultimately impose on them. The smartest thing for Russia to do is to be an unfettered supplier of power in Europe, an unquestioned supplier of power in Europe, a reliable, well-behaved provider of power to Europe. Europe's a marvellous market. It's wealthy. It's got a stable and relatively rising demand. Why make a mess of it? It's not a rational decision from a Moscow point of view to place all your eggs in the basket of a power with a very different set of profile from that of Europe, and with options to you that in a way can keep your prices very suppressed.
Mr. Ambassador, you have given us an extraordinarily interesting session today, and we thank you for it. May we sometime or another get you back again.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah. Now I can see what my daughter is up to.